The question wasn't loud, it wasn't even spoken aloud. But it hung heavy in the damp October air, settling over the cemetery like the mist clinging to the headstones. Why does she keep coming back? 3 weeks, 21 days, since they'd lowered Gran into the cold Sussex earth. And every single afternoon, like clockwork tuned to a silent, sorrowful chime, the old tabby cat would appear. Eleanor felt the chill seep through her thin coat as she stood, partially hidden by the dripping branches of a yew tree. She wasn't hiding, not really, just watching. Observing the ritual that had become her strange, aching solace in the bewildering aftermath of loss. The date was October 17th, a Tuesday, the kind of gray, drizzling English afternoon that felt like the world itself was weeping. Leaves, russet and gold, plastered themselves to the wet gravel paths. The air smelled of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the faint, distant tang of wood smoke from a nearby village. Silence pressed down, broken only by the rhythmic plink, plink of water dripping from the yew's dark needles onto her hood, and the occasional mournful caw of a rook. Eleanor was adrift, 32 years old, standing in a graveyard, feeling utterly untethered. Gran's passing wasn't unexpected. 91 is a good, long run, they said, but the emptiness it carved out was staggering. The cozy cottage in the village of Fern Hollow, where Eleanor had spent every childhood summer, now felt cavernous, echoing with absence. She'd taken a sabbatical from her graphic design job in London, ostensibly to sort Gran's things, to put affairs in order. Really, she was just trying to learn how to breathe again in a world without the woman who'd been her anchor. Guilt, a familiar, unwelcome companion, whispered that she hadn't visited enough in the final year, that she'd been too busy building a life that suddenly felt insubstantial. Change was inevitable, but this change felt like an amputation. And then there was Marmalade. Gran had simply called her Cat. But Eleanor, aged 7 and obsessed with the sticky sweetness of toast toppings, had bestowed the name Marmalade. It had stuck for 16 years. Marmalade wasn't a conventionally pretty cat. Age had settled upon her like a well-worn shawl. Her once vibrant ginger and cream fur was muted, patchy in places, thick and ruffled along her spine. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each step seeming to carry the weight of years and loyalty. Her green eyes, clouded slightly by the beginnings of cataracts, held a depth that felt unnervingly human. A ragged notch in her left ear, a souvenir from some long-ago territorial dispute, gave her a faintly piratical air. She rarely vocalized anymore, except for a low, rumbling purr that seemed to originate deep within her fragile ribcage, or a soft, raspy MRP, when surprised. But this daily pilgrimage, this was Marmalade's language now. Her testament. Eleanor watched as the old cat picked her way carefully across the uneven ground. Her paws, thickened with age, sank slightly into the rain-softened earth. She moved with a quiet dignity, a purpose that transcended the frailty of her body. She didn't hurry. She didn't look around. Her gaze was fixed on the mound of earth, still raw and covered by a blanket of fading funeral flowers, chrysanthemums mostly, their vibrant oranges and yellows now browned at the edges, weeping in the rain. Marmalade reached the grave. She didn't pace, didn't meow. She simply settled. With a soft grunt of effort, she lowered herself onto the damp earth directly at the head of the mound, right where Gran's pillow would have been, had she been lying in a bed, not beneath it. She tucked her paws neatly beneath her chest, her tail curling around her flank like a protective barrier. Then she rested her chin on the ground, her clouded eyes fixed on the simple headstone bearing Gran's name, Edith Mayweather. Beloved Gran. Forever in our hearts. It was a posture of profound stillness. A vigil. She wouldn't sleep, Eleanor knew. She would simply be. For hours. Until the light began to fade and the chill deepened, forcing even the most devoted sentinel to seek shelter. Eleanor's own breath hitched. She remembered finding marmalade like this beside Gran's hospital bed in the cramped living room during those final weeks. Curled precisely at pillow level, chin resting on the blanket, watching Gran's labored breathing with unwavering focus. The nurses had called it sweet, touching. Eleanor had seen it as something deeper. An ancient pact of companionship, witnessed to the very end. And now, the end had come. For Gran. But not, it seemed, for Marmalade's devotion. "What do you know, old girl?" Eleanor whispered, the sound swallowed instantly by the wet air. The question wasn't just for the cat. It was for herself. What did Marmalade feel in that damp earth? What memory, what scent, what invisible thread still pulled her back to this patch of sorrow day after day? Was it love? Habit? A feline inability to grasp the finality of death? Or something else, something Eleanor couldn't name, but felt resonate in her own hollowed-out chest? She shifted her weight, her boots crunching softly on wet gravel. Marmalade's ears twitched, rotating slightly towards the sound, but she didn't lift her head. Her gaze remained locked on the headstone, unwavering. The rain intensified, pattering on the leaves above Eleanor, dripping onto Marmalade's thick fur. The cat didn't flinch. She simply closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in a kind of profound acceptance. Or concentration. Eleanor felt a tear, warm against her cold cheek, mingle with the rain. It wasn't just grief for Gran anymore. It was this raw, wordless display of loyalty from a creature nearing the end of its own span. It was the unbearable tenderness of it. The sheer, stubborn refusal of a small, old heart to let go. She pulled her coat tighter, the damp wool scratchy against her neck. Sorting through Gran's teacups and knitting patterns suddenly felt trivial, meaningless. The life waiting for her back in London felt distant, alien. Here, in this gray, dripping cemetery, watching an ancient tabby keep watch over dust, something real was happening. Something elemental. Before we begin, if stories like this touch your heart, please like the video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It means a lot to us. Eleanor hadn't planned on staying. She'd only meant to drop off fresh flowers. But now, rooted to the spot behind the yew tree, she couldn't leave. Not yet. To leave felt like abandoning Marmalade in her vigil. Like turning her back on something sacred. The mist thickened, blurring the edges of the gravestones, wrapping the scene in a soft, gray shroud. Marmalade became a muted patch of ginger against the dark earth, a small, still monument to memory. The rhythmic dripping of water, the distant rooks, the soft sigh of the wind through the yew, it all faded into a background hum. All Eleanor was truly aware of was the old cat's profound stillness, the rise and fall of her shallow breathing, and the quiet, relentless pull of the grave beneath her. She leaned her forehead against the rough, wet bark of the yew tree. The cold seeped into her skin, sharpening her senses. The guilt, the confusion, the sheer weight of the empty cottage, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of focus. Marmalade on the grave. This wasn't just the cat mourning. This felt like the beginning of something, a silent dialogue between the living and the gone, mediated by fur and earth and ancient instinct. A shift, not in the world but within Eleanor herself. A quiet, insistent turning of a key she hadn't known was there, deep in the frozen lock of her grief. She watched the rain bead on Marmalade's fur, watched the unwavering focus in those clouded green eyes fixed on the stone, and felt the first fragile stirring of a question she hadn't dared ask. "What are you waiting for, old friend?" And beneath that, a whisper, even softer, "What am I waiting for?" The afternoon deepened towards twilight, the light leaching from the sky, but Eleanor stayed, hidden and silent, bearing witness to the tabby's unwavering watch. Something important, something quiet and immense, had indeed begun. The gray light of the following morning found Eleanor in Gran's kitchen, the air thick with the scent of dust motes dancing in the weak sunbeam cutting through the lace curtains, and something else. Something deeper. The lingering ghost of Gran's lavender talcum powder, the faint, greasy memory of countless fried breakfasts soaked into the wooden beams, and the undeniable, musky aroma of old cat. Fern Hollow Cottage wasn't just quiet, it felt listening. Every creak of the floorboard underfoot, every gurgle of the ancient plumbing, echoed in the stillness like a misplaced heartbeat. Eleanor clutched a chipped mug of tea, its warmth barely penetrating the chill that had settled in her bones since yesterday's vigil in the cemetery. Marmalade was out there again, she knew. Back at the grave. The thought was a physical ache. Sorting Gran's things felt like trespassing. Eleanor opened the heavy oak dresser in the dining room, releasing a puff of cedar and mothballs. Inside lay stacks of neatly folded linen, embroidered with initials she didn't recognize. Each napkin, each tablecloth, felt imbued with decades of Sunday roasts and Christmas crackers. She pulled out a yellowed tablecloth, its lace edging brittle, and a small, hard object tumbled out, clattering onto the flagstone floor. It was a smooth river stone, gray and cool to the touch. Unremarkable, except for the single word, painstakingly painted in faded white letters, patience. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear, Gran, sitting in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, Marmalade a ginger puddle in her lap. Gran's gnarled fingers stroking the cat's head. "She teaches me patience, this one," Gran had murmured, her voice soft with affection. "Always waiting for her supper, for a lap, for spring, never rushing. Just being." Eleanor had laughed then, young and impatient herself. Now, the stone felt heavy in her palm, a silent reprimand. Was she rushing? Trying to box up Gran's life and her own grief too quickly? The back door rattled softly. Eleanor turned. Marmalade stood on the worn doormat, damp leaves clinging to her thick fur, her sides heaving slightly from the walk back from the cemetery. She didn't meow for entry. She simply stood there, her green eyes fixed on Eleanor, unblinking. Raindrops glistened on her whiskers. Eleanor opened the door. The old cat padded in silently, leaving tiny, wet paw prints on the flagstones. She didn't head for the kitchen, her usual destination for a post-outing snack. Instead, she walked directly to the cold hearth in the living room, the spot where Gran's armchair used to sit before the hospital bed arrived. The chair was gone now, donated. Marmalade circled the empty space once, twice, her tail twitching. Then, with a soft sigh, she sank down onto the bare floorboards, tucking herself into a tight ball, facing the emptiness where the chair had been. Her eyes closed, but Eleanor sensed no sleep, only a profound stillness, a continuation of her graveside vigil indoors. Eleanor's throat tightened. She moved quietly into the kitchen, opening a tin of the senior cat food Gran had always bought. The pungent smell of fish and vitamins filled the small space. She scooped it into Marmalade's familiar blue ceramic bowl, the one chipped on the rim from being knocked off the counter years ago. She placed it gently on the floor near the aga, the cottage's warm heart. "Breakfast, Marmalade?" she called softly, her voice sounding too loud in the silence. No response. No eager patter of paws. Eleanor waited. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the relentless tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. Finally, with a rustle, Marmalade appeared in the kitchen doorway. She paused, surveying the room, her gaze lingering on the empty space beside the aga where Gran's stool used to be. Then, slowly, deliberately, she approached the bowl. She didn't crouch and eat immediately. She sniffed the food, her nose twitching. Then, she lifted her head and looked directly at Eleanor. Not a pleading look, nor a demanding one. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet, weary recognition. "You are here. The food is here." She is not. After a long moment, she lowered her head and began to eat, slowly, methodically, the only sound the soft snick-snick of her aged teeth. Later that afternoon, Eleanor tried to impose routine. Gran's routine. She filled Marmalade's water bowl with fresh, cold water. She opened the back door to the small, overgrown garden, hoping the old cat might want to bask in a rare patch of weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. Marmalade stood on the threshold, sniffed the damp air, glanced towards the lane that led to the cemetery, then turned and walked back into the dim living room, resuming her position on the bare floorboards. The rejection stung, sharp and irrational. Eleanor felt foolish. What had she expected? Purrs and leg rubs? This cat's world had shrunk to the size of a grave and the ghost of an armchair. Days blurred into a pattern defined by Marmalade's pilgrimage. Morning, the slow walk to the cemetery. Mid-afternoon, the weary return. The silent vigil in the empty space. The hesitant acceptance of food offered by Eleanor's hand, but never sought. Eleanor found herself structuring her own empty days around the cat's movements. She'd watch from the kitchen window as the ginger form disappeared down the lane, a small, determined speck against the green. She'd feel the cottage exhale, the silence deepening. Then the waiting, the clock ticking, the dust motes dancing, the guilt gnawing. Had she done enough for Gran? Why did this cat's grief feel so much purer, so much more faithful, than her own tangled mess of sadness and relief and city life impatience? One evening, rain lashing against the windows, turning the garden into a gray-green smudge, Eleanor sat on the threadbare rug near the cold hearth. She'd been attempting to sort through a box of old photographs, sepia-toned ancestors staring sternly, Gran as a young woman laughing, Eleanor herself as a gap-toothed child clutching Marmalade as a kitten. The memories were a physical weight. Tears she hadn't realized were building spilled over, hot and silent. She dropped a photo, burying her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with the force of a grief she'd been holding back. She didn't hear Marmalade approach. There was no warning purr, no soft meow. Suddenly, there was warmth. A gentle pressure against her bent knee. Eleanor lifted her tear-streaked face. Marmalade was there. Not on her vigil spot. Beside her. The old cat had silently crossed the room. She leaned her weight, solid and real, against Eleanor's leg. Her clouded green eyes gazed up, not at Eleanor's face, but at her hands covering it. Then, slowly, deliberately, Marmalade lifted a front paw. Not to bat at her, not to demand anything. She placed it with infinite care on Eleanor's forearm where it rested on her knee. The pads were rough, warm, surprisingly heavy. She held it there. A grounding touch. The silent, profound "I am here." Eleanor froze. The simple contact sent a jolt through her. It wasn't affection, not exactly. It felt deeper. like shared sorrow. Like a creature who understood the language of absence, speaking a wordless sentence of solidarity. The weight of the paw, the warmth radiating through her sleeve, the steady, quiet presence, it undid her completely. She reached out a trembling hand, not to pet, but to gently rest her fingertips on the thick fur between Marmalade's ears. The cat didn't flinch. She didn't purr. She simply held her paw on Eleanor's arm, her gaze steady. Her breath, a soft, wheezing rhythm, filled the space between them. They stayed like that for a long time, the rain drumming on the roof, the fire unlit, the photographs forgotten on the rug. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was thick with shared memory, with unspoken loss, with the fragile beginnings of a bridge being built between two grieving hearts in a house that echoed with absence. Eleanor felt the tight knot in her chest loosen, just a fraction. The guilt didn't vanish, the grief didn't lessen, but it became a weight she didn't have to carry entirely alone in that moment. There was another soul here, bearing witness. Later, as dusk painted the room in shades of violet, Marmalade withdrew her paw. She didn't retreat to her vigil spot. Instead, she turned in a slow circle beside Eleanor, then settled down on the rug, her back just touching Eleanor's leg. Not demanding closeness, but offering proximity. A silent agreement. Eleanor leaned back against the cold stone of the hearth, her hand resting lightly on the warm, breathing bulk of the old tabby. She looked towards the empty space where Gran's chair had been. The ache was still there, a deep hollow. But now, curled beside her on the worn rug, was a small, warm, living testament to the love that had filled that chair. Marmalade wasn't just mourning. She was carrying something, a legacy of devotion. And in the quiet darkness of the cottage, with the rain whispering outside and the old cat's breath a soft counterpoint to her own, Eleanor began to understand that her task wasn't just to sort through teacups and linens. It was to learn how to hold space for this ancient, faithful grief, and perhaps, in doing so, learn how to hold her own. The river stone, patience, lay forgotten on the dresser, but its lesson had finally, quietly begun to sink in. The connection wasn't loud, it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was a start. The fragile piece, the tentative bridge built on shared silence and a paw on an arm, lasted a week. 7 days where the rhythm of Fern Hollow Cottage shifted, softened. Eleanor stopped structuring her days solely around Marmalade's cemetery vigil. Instead, she found herself waiting for the return. For the soft scrape of the cat flap, the slow pad of weary paws on flagstones, the quiet presence that would eventually settle near her, if not with her. She'd work on sorting a drawer, or sit reading one of Gran's old novels, acutely aware of the warm, breathing weight a few feet away on the rug. Marmalade still spent hours gazing at the empty space, but the intensity felt less desperate. Or perhaps Eleanor was learning to read the subtle language of feline sorrow differently. Then came the scratching. It started faintly the first night. Eleanor, lying awake in the narrow bed in what was once her childhood room, straining to hear the familiar, comforting wheeze of Marmalade's breath from the basket she'd placed near the radiator downstairs. Instead, she heard it, a soft, persistent scritch, 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 like claws on wood. Slow, deliberate. It stopped after a minute. Eleanor dismissed it. An old cat, restless. Adjusting. Maybe dreaming. The next night, it was louder. Longer. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The pause. Then again. Not frantic, but unervingly rhythmic. Like someone trying to pick a lock with a fingernail. It seemed to come from downstairs, near the living room. Eleanor crept down, her heart thudding against her ribs, the old stairs groaning under her weight. She flicked on the weak hall light. Marmalade was sitting bolt upright in the center of the living room rug, facing the far wall. Not the wall where Gran's chair had been. The opposite wall. The one dominated by a heavy, dark oak bureau, a piece of furniture Eleanor had always found slightly forbidding. Gran called it her memory keeper, but Eleanor couldn't recall ever seeing it open. It was perpetually locked, the key mysteriously absent. Marmalade wasn't looking at Eleanor. Her clouded green eyes were fixed intently on the bureau's lower left drawer. As Eleanor watched, frozen on the threshold, the old cat lifted a paw. Not to wash, not to stretch. She extended her claws and deliberately, slowly, dragged them down the front panel of the drawer. "Pritch, Marmalade?" Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with sleep and unease. The sound stopped instantly. Marmalade's head swiveled towards her. Her expression wasn't guilty. It was expectant, alert, as if waiting for Eleanor to do something. Then, with a soft "ing," she lowered her paw, turned in a circle, and settled back down on the rug, closing her eyes. The message was clear: show's over. For now. The scratching became the new nocturnal soundtrack. Every night, like clockwork after midnight, it would begin. Sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 20. Always focused on that same drawer of the locked bureau. Eleanor tried everything. She placed cardboard over the spot. Marmalade simply scratched beside it. She sprayed a citrus deterrent Gran had once used to keep cats off counters. Marmalade sneezed, blinked, and resumed scratching with renewed, almost offended, vigor. Eleanor brought Marmalade's basket upstairs to her room. The old cat yowled, a low, distressed sound Eleanor had never heard before, a sound that scraped raw against her nerves until she relented and let her back downstairs. The scratching continued. During the day, Marmalade returned to her routines, the cemetery, the vigil spot, accepting food from Eleanor with that same weary acknowledgement. But Eleanor noticed a change. The quiet companionship on the rug dwindled. Marmalade seemed preoccupied, distant. Her gaze, when not fixed on emptiness or the grave, would often drift towards the bureau. She'd sit near it, not scratching, just staring. A low, almost inaudible rumble, not quite a purr, would sometimes vibrate in her chest. Curiosity curdled into a low-grade anxiety within Eleanor. What was in that drawer? Why was Marmalade obsessed with it? Was it a smell? Had Gran stored catnip in there decades ago? Or was it something else? Something tied to Gran, to the scent Marmalade seemed to chase even beyond the grave? The locked bureau became a physical manifestation of the questions swirling in Eleanor's mind. What secrets had Gran kept in that dark wood? Why had she never opened it? The bureau stood there, solid, silent, and suddenly menacing in its secrecy. The tension wasn't just about the cat anymore. It seeped into Eleanor's own grieving process. Sorting Gran's belongings now felt like an act of voyeurism, heightened by the enigma of the bureau. She'd catch herself staring at it, imagining what lay inside. Letters from a lost love? Documents about a past no one knew? Something valuable? Something painful? The scratching at night became a soundtrack to her own rising internal conflict. Should she respect Gran's privacy, even in death? Or should she try to open it, to understand what was pulling Marmalade, and now herself, towards it with such unsettling persistence? One afternoon, while Marmalade was at the cemetery, Eleanor knelt before the bureau. She ran her fingers over the cool, smooth oak. It was beautifully made, heavy, with intricate scrollwork on the sides. The keyholes, one for each of the 3 drawers, were small, dark, and impenetrable. She tugged gently at the handles. Solidly locked. She pressed her nose close to the wood where Marmalade scratched. No discernible smell, just old wood and dust. Yet Marmalade returned to that spot night after night. Eleanor sat back on her heels, frustration warring with a growing sense of dread. Was Marmalade trying to tell her something? Was this some bizarre feline grief ritual, fixating on an object associated with Gran? Or was there a more practical, unsettling reason? A mouse trapped inside long ago? The thought made Eleanor shudder. She remembered Gran mentioning years ago that Marmalade had been an exceptional mouser in her youth. Could the scent of long-dead vermin linger, triggering some primal instinct in the old cat? The explanation felt flimsy, unsatisfying. It didn't account for the focus, the daily staring, the sheer intensity of the nocturnal scratching. That evening, as she placed Marmalade's food bowl down, the cat didn't immediately approach. She sat near the bureau, staring at the drawer. Her tail twitched, the very tip flicking like a metronome set to a nervous tempo. "Come on, old girl," Eleanor urged softly, tapping the bowl. "Dinner." Marmalade slowly turned her head. Her gaze met Eleanor's, but it wasn't the weary acknowledgement of before. It was tense, questioning, almost accusatory. "Why haven't you opened it?" the look seemed to say. Then, deliberately, she looked back at the bureau drawer. And stayed there. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft under the kitchen door. The silent standoff lasted minutes. Finally, with a soft sigh that sounded like disappointment, Marmalade padded slowly to her bowl and began to eat, her movements listless. She left half the food untouched. The untouched food became the breaking point. The next morning, the bowl was still half full. Marmalade went to the cemetery, but returned earlier than usual. She walked straight past Eleanor, ignoring the fresh water and food offered, and went to sit directly in front of the bureau. She didn't scratch. She just sat, staring. Her sides looked thinner. Her fur seemed duller. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Eleanor's confusion and frustration. This wasn't just obsession. This was decline. Marmalade was fading, her spirit seemingly tethered to whatever secret lay behind that locked wood. The scratching wasn't just noise, it was a plea. A desperate act from a creature whose world had already lost its center, now fixated on the one tangible connection she couldn't reach. Eleanor stood in the middle of the cottage's dim living room, the weight of the silent cat's gaze and the imposing presence of the locked bureau pressing in on her. The peaceful rhythm they'd tentatively established was shattered. The question wasn't just what was in the bureau anymore. It was a stark, terrifying choice. Honor Gran's privacy and potentially watch Marmalade's silent vigil turn into a slow surrender to whatever was consuming her? Or violate that privacy? Break into a piece of furniture her beloved Gran had kept locked for as long as Eleanor could remember? The scratching had stopped being a nuisance. It had become the insistent, ragged heartbeat of a mystery that was now intertwined with the fragile life of an old, grieving cat. The tension in the cottage was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Marmalade's unwavering stare from the floor, fixed on the bureau drawer, felt like an unspoken ultimatum. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached into the junk drawer in the kitchen, her fingers closing around the cold, hard steel of a screwdriver. The quiet shift in her heart had become a thunderous, impossible question echoing in the silence. What price do I pay for loyalty? The answer, she knew, was written on the worn oak of Gran's memory keeper and reflected in the clouded, waiting eyes of the old tabby cat. The The silence in the cottage was deafening. Only the frantic hammering of Eleanor's own heart filled the space between her and the locked bureau. Marmalade hadn't moved. She sat like a small ginger sphinx directly before the lower left drawer, her clouded eyes fixed on Eleanor with an unnerving, unwavering intensity. The half-full food bowl mocked Eleanor from the kitchen doorway. The air felt thick, charged with the old cat's silent demand and Eleanor's own rising panic. Watching Marmalade waste away, tethered to this inexplicable obsession, was a pain sharper than the grief she'd carried for weeks. Loyalty to Gran's privacy warred violently with loyalty to this living, breathing creature Gran had loved. The screwdriver in her hand felt cold, heavy, blasphemous. "Forgive me," Eleanor whispered, the words catching in her dry throat. She knelt before the imposing oak bureau, its dark wood seeming to absorb the weak afternoon light filtering through the lace curtains. The intricate scroll work felt suddenly menacing, like carved warnings. She positioned the tip of the screwdriver into the small, brass keyhole of the lower left drawer, the precise spot Marmalade had scratched night after night. Her hand trembled violently. Marmalade didn't flinch. She watched, utterly still, her ragged ears pricked forward, her breathing shallow. No purr. No sound. Just that unnerving, expectant stare. Eleanor took a shuddering breath. She pushed. Metal scraped harshly against metal. The sound was jarring, invasive, echoing off the cottage walls. She twisted, applying pressure, feeling the ancient mechanism resist. Sweat beaded on her forehead. I'm breaking her trust. I'm breaking into her life. Guilt washed over her in a sickening wave. She almost stopped. Almost threw the screwdriver down. Then Marmalade made a sound. Not a meow. A low, soft emma. Almost encouraging? Or was it just Eleanor's desperate hope projecting meaning? Gritting her teeth, Eleanor pushed harder, twisting with both hands now, putting her weight behind it. There was a sharp crack, not loud, but final. The lock mechanism splintered inside the wood. The drawer slid open an inch, sticking on its worn runners. A scent bloomed into the room. Not dust, not mothballs. Something entirely different. Sweet and dry and achingly familiar. Lavender. Gran's lavender talcum powder, yes, but layered over it, the faint, ghostly aroma of her. Gran's unique scent, imperial leather soap, Earl Grey tea, and something indefinably warm and comforting, like sunshine on old wool. Eleanor froze, the screwdriver slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers and clattering onto the flagstones. The scent enveloped her, a sensory punch to the gut that brought tears instantly, hot and stinging, to her eyes. It was Gran, distilled. Trapped in this drawer for years. Marmalade reacted instantly. With a strength Eleanor hadn't seen in weeks, the old cat surged forward. She didn't hesitate. She shoved her head into the narrow gap of the open drawer, her body trembling, a low, rumbling purr erupting from deep within her chest, a sound Eleanor hadn't heard since before Gran died. It wasn't the wheezy purr of contentment. It was deeper, more resonant, almost primal. A sound of profound recognition. Of homecoming. Eleanor, tears blurring her vision, gently pulled the drawer open the rest of the way. It resisted, sticky with disuse. Inside, it wasn't filled with secrets of espionage or hidden treasure. It was ordinary. Heartbreakingly ordinary, yet saturated with meaning. Neatly folded on top was a soft, hand-knitted scarf in shades of heather gray and lavender wool. Eleanor recognized it instantly. Gran had worn it every winter for as long as Eleanor could remember. Seeing it here, carefully preserved, felt like seeing Gran's skin laid bare. Underneath the scarf lay a small bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon. And beside them, tucked into the corner, was a smooth, gray river stone. This one bore a single word, painted in the same careful, white script. Courage. Patience. Courage. The stones weren't just decorations, they were messages. Gran's quiet philosophy etched onto the landscape of her life. But Eleanor's attention was snatched back to Marmalade. The old tabby had buried her face deep into the folds of the lavender-gray scarf, inhaling deeply, her purr vibrating the entire drawer. She rubbed her cheek against the wool over and over, a desperate, loving gesture Eleanor recognized. It was how Marmalade used to greet Gran every single morning, pressing her face against Gran's slippers, her skirt, her hand. Bunting. Marking her person with her scent, reaffirming their bond. Now, Marmalade was doing it to the scarf, to the scent trapped within its fibers. She wasn't scratching at a mystery. She wasn't chasing a mouse. She was clawing her way back to the one thing her fading senses could still grasp, the essence of the woman she had loved and lost. The scent was her anchor, her connection, the only tangible remnant of her world. "Oh, Marmalade," Eleanor breathed, the words choked with sobs. The understanding crashed over her, immense and humbling. This wasn't obsession. It was devotion rendered in its purest, most desperate form. Marmalade hadn't been trying to tell Eleanor a secret. She'd been trying to reach the only thing that still mattered. The scent was Gran, preserved in this drawer like a sacred relic, and Marmalade, guided by instincts deeper than human understanding, had known. She had known it was there. Eleanor sank back onto her heels, her legs unable to hold her. She watched, tears streaming freely now, as Marmalade continued her ritual. The cat pushed the scarf with her nose, kneaded it with her front paws, purring so loudly it filled the silent cottage, her clouded eyes half closed in an expression of profound relief, of sorrowful bliss. She wasn't looking at Eleanor. She was lost in a sensory memory, reunited, however fleetingly, with her person. The guilt Eleanor had felt about breaking the lock evaporated, replaced by a wave of such intense, shared sorrow and love that it stole her breath. She understood now. The scratching wasn't a demand for Eleanor to act. It was Marmalade's own, futile attempt to access what she knew lay beyond the wood. Her nightly vigil at the drawer was an echo of her daily vigil at the grave. Both were acts of unwavering fidelity. One to the body, one to the spirit, captured in scent. Eleanor reached out a trembling hand, not towards the scarf Marmalade was claiming, but towards the cat's heaving flank. Her fingers touched the thick, warm fur. Marmalade didn't startle. She didn't stop her purring or her bunting. She simply leaned, ever so slightly, into the touch. A silent acknowledgement. "We are both here. We both remember." Eleanor's fingers brushed the rough wool of the scarf. It was softer than she remembered, infused with the lavender and imperial leather and Gran. The dam inside her broke completely. Sobs racked her body, great heaving gasps she couldn't control. Grief she'd held at bay, guilt she'd nurtured, the profound loneliness of the empty cottage, it all poured out, raw and unfiltered. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. A warm weight pressed against her bent knee. Eleanor lowered her hands, her vision blurred. Marmalade had pulled her face from the scarf. She sat beside Eleanor now, leaning her entire body against her leg, just as she had done that night on the rug. Her purr, though still resonant, had softened. Her green eyes, less clouded than Eleanor had seen them in weeks, gazed up at her. Not with expectation this time. With understanding? Companionship? The old cat lifted her head and gently, so gently, butted Eleanor's wet cheek with her forehead. A feline kiss. A gesture of pure, uncomplicated comfort. I know it hurts. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the old tabby, burying her face in the thick, slightly musty fur of her neck. She breathed in the scent of cat and dust and the lingering ghost of Gran from the scarf. Marmalade didn't stiffen. She sank into the embrace, her purr deepening, vibrating against Eleanor's chest, a steady, grounding rhythm in the storm of her tears. They stayed like that, tangled together on the cold flagstones before the open drawer, the scent of lavender and loss and love swirling around them. The bureau wasn't a secret keeper anymore, it was a reliquary. And Marmalade, with her ancient instincts, had led them both to this moment of shattering, shared release. The mystery wasn't solved, it was transcended. The locked drawer had held the key not to Gran's past, but to unlocking the deepest chambers of their shared grief. In the scent of an old scarf and the purr of an old cat, Eleanor found something she hadn't realized she was searching for: permission to truly mourn and the profound, wordless comfort of knowing she wasn't mourning alone. The raw connection wasn't just between human and cat, it was a bridge spanning the chasm of death, built on memory and scent and the unbreakable thread of love. The silence that followed the storm of tears wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with understanding, saturated with shared loss, and finally, beginning to feel like peace. The cottage didn't magically transform overnight. Grief didn't vanish like mist under a sudden sun. But the air, the heavy, listening silence that had pressed down on Fern Hollow Cottage for weeks, it shifted. It didn't disappear, but it softened, becoming porous, breathable. The raw, jagged edges of sorrow were still there, but now they were wrapped in something else. Something like understanding. Shared understanding. The open bureau drawer remained open for days. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to close it. It felt like sealing away a sacred space. The scent of lavender, imperial leather, and Gran lingered, a gentle, pervasive presence. Marmalade no longer scratched at the wood in the dead of night. Her obsession had found its object. She would often amble over to the bureau, sometimes several times a day. Not to stare intensely, but to simply visit. She'd sniff delicately at the open drawer, rub her cheek against its edge, or curl up nearby on the rug, facing it, her purr a soft, contented rumble. It was less a vigil, more a quiet companionship with a cherished memory made tangible. The lavender-gray scarf became Marmalade's sanctuary. Eleanor carefully laid it over the old cat's basket near the radiator. Marmalade took immediate possession. She kneaded it, buried her face in its folds, slept curled upon it for hours, her breathing deeper, more peaceful than Eleanor had witnessed since before Gran's final illness. The frantic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by a profound, weary calm. She wasn't chasing the scent anymore, she was resting in it. It was her anchor, her comfort, her tangible piece of the woman she'd loved. Eleanor watched her, a lump forming in her throat. Marmalade's physical decline hadn't reversed. She was still an ancient cat, but the spirit that had seemed so perilously close to extinguishing itself, it had steadied. It glowed with a quiet, resilient warmth. The untouched food bowls became a thing of the past. Marmalade ate with a renewed, though still slow, appetite. She even began seeking out patches of weak afternoon sun slanting through the kitchen window, basking with a looseness in her limbs that spoke of relief, not just exhaustion. Eleanor's own routine shifted. Sorting Gran's belongings no longer felt like a violation, but an act of tender curation. She handled the teacups, the knitting needles, the stacks of linen with reverence, but without the suffocating weight of guilt. The bureau's contents, once a source of such tension, were now a quiet revelation. The bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon? Mostly mundane, notes from old friends, receipts, a pressed flower. But nestled amongst them was a single, faded photograph Eleanor had never seen. Gran as a young woman, perhaps 18, standing beside a handsome, unknown man by a riverbank, both laughing, carefree. On the back, in Gran's familiar looping script, Jack. Summer of '52. Before the rain. A glimpse of a life Eleanor never knew Gran had lived. It wasn't scandalous, it was beautiful. A reminder that Gran, too, had been young, had loved, had secrets made of sunshine and river water. The river stones, patience and courage, sat together now on the kitchen windowsill, catching the light. Eleanor found her fingers tracing their smooth surfaces throughout the day. Gran's quiet philosophy wasn't just words anymore. It was etched in stone, witnessed in the devotion of an old cat, and now felt in Eleanor's own bones. She began to spend more time simply being in the cottage. Not rushing to sort, not hiding from memories, but inhabiting the space Gran had loved. She lit the fire in the hearth one chilly evening, the first time since Gran's passing. The crackle of logs, the warmth spreading through the room, it felt like welcoming back an old friend. Marmalade, drawn by the warmth, abandoned her scarf basket and settled on the rug before the flames. Not on her vigil spot, but close enough to feel the heat. Eleanor sat beside her, not touching, just sharing the space, the light, the quiet crackle. One afternoon, as Eleanor sorted through a box of Gran's old knitting patterns, intricate ferrule designs and simple baby booties, Marmalade padded over. She didn't lean against Eleanor's leg. Instead, she did something she hadn't done since Gran was alive. With a soft grunt, she hopped up onto the threadbare armchair Eleanor was using. Not onto Eleanor's lap, but onto the chair itself, curling up beside her hip, her body radiating warmth against Eleanor's side. Her purr, a deep, resonant thrum, vibrated through the cushion. Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over a pattern for a ridiculously complicated Aran sweater. Tears welled, not of sorrow this time, but of a profound, almost overwhelming tenderness. This wasn't the desperate contact of shared grief, nor the weary acknowledgement of necessity. This was just comfort. A choice. Marmalade wasn't seeking scent, she was seeking presence. Eleanor's presence. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor lowered her hand, not to pet, but to rest it gently on the warm curve of Marmalade's back. The purr intensified. The old cat shifted slightly, pressing her head against Eleanor's forearm. A simple gesture. A monumental shift. Life moved forward, but the axis had tilted. The cottage began to feel less like a museum of loss and more like a home again. Eleanor's home. A home that held Gran's memory like a precious heirloom, not a crushing burden. She started venturing beyond the village lanes, walking in the damp autumn woods, the scent of decaying leaves and wet earth filling her lungs. She even called her boss in London, her voice surprisingly steady, requesting an extension on her sabbatical. "Family matters," she said, and it wasn't a lie. It felt deeply true. Marmalade continued her daily pilgrimage to the cemetery, but the ritual changed. Eleanor often walked partway with her now, not hiding, but keeping a respectful distance as the old cat made her slow, deliberate way to the grave. She'd watch as Marmalade settled on the earth, but instead of the intense, chin-down vigil, the cat often seemed more relaxed. She'd sit upright, surveying the graveyard, blinking slowly in the weak sun, or sometimes even curl up and nap for a short while on the mound. She still went. The pull was still there, but it felt less like a desperate clinging, more like a visit. A conversation. The raw wound had begun to scar over, for both of them. One crisp November morning, frost silvering the grass, Eleanor accompanied Marmalade all the way to the grave. She stood a few feet back as the cat performed her familiar ritual of circling, sniffing, and settling. The headstone glistened with moisture. Eleanor looked at the inscription, Edith Mayweather. Beloved Gran. Forever in our hearts. She traced the words in her mind, then looked down at Marmalade. The old cat wasn't looking at the stone. She was looking out across the rows of graves, towards the distant yew tree where Eleanor had hidden weeks before, watching her. Marmalade's green eyes, still clouded, seemed peaceful. She let out a soft sigh, a puff of visible breath in the cold air, and rested her chin on her paws, closing her eyes. Not in sorrowful vigil, but in simple, quiet repose. Eleanor knelt. Not to pray, not to weep, just to be closer. She placed her hand lightly on the cold earth of the grave mound, near where Marmalade lay. She didn't speak to Gran. She spoke to Marmalade, her voice barely a whisper. She loved you so much, old girl. You know that, don't you? Marmalade opened one eye, regarded Eleanor for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, stretched out a front paw. Not towards the grave, but towards Eleanor's hand resting on the earth. She didn't place her paw on Eleanor's hand. She placed it gently, firmly, on the bare earth between Eleanor's hand and her own body. A bridge, connecting them both to the earth, to the memory beneath, to each other. Her purr started, low and steady, vibrating through the frozen ground. Eleanor felt the vibration travel up her arm, settling deep in her chest. It wasn't just Marmalade purring. It felt like the earth itself humming. A resonance. A connection spanning species, spanning life and death, held together by the fierce, quiet force of love and loyalty. The mystery of the bureau was solved, the tension dissolved. But a deeper mystery remained, the inexplicable, enduring power of a bond that not even death could fully sever. It wasn't closure, not exactly. The ache for Gran was still a quiet companion. But it was peace. A soft, resilient peace, as tangible as the frost on the grass, as warm as the old cat's purr vibrating through the cold earth. The choice wasn't about London or Fern Hollow anymore. It was about learning to carry the love forward, scarred but whole. Eleanor left her hand on the earth, feeling the connection beneath Marmalade's rough paw pad, watching the slow rise and fall of the old cat's breathing against the dark soil. The world felt vast, quiet, and somehow complete. Winter settled over Fern Hollow like a worn, gray blanket. Frost silvered the grass blades in the mornings, and a thin skin of ice sometimes formed on the birdbath in Gran's neglected garden. Inside the cottage, though, a different kind of warmth persisted. Not the frantic heat of grief, nor the forced cheer of denial, but a slow, deep-burning ember of shared life. The scent from the bureau drawer, lavender, imperial leather, Gran, began inevitably to fade. It didn't vanish overnight, but day by day, the sharpness softened, blending with the smells of wood smoke from the hearth, of Eleanor's cooking, of Marmalade's own quiet presence. Eleanor noticed the change first in Marmalade. The old cat still visited the open drawer, still nestled into her scarf-shrouded basket. But the frantic burying of her face, the intense kneading, it lessened. She'd sniff, perhaps give the wool a gentle nudge with her nose, then settle down with a sigh that sounded more like acceptance than longing. She still purred there, but it was the purr of comfort, not the purr of desperate reunion. The scent was becoming a memory held within the fibers, not the living presence it had been. It was a natural fading, a gentle letting go. One crisp January afternoon, sunlight, weak but determined, streamed through the kitchen window. Eleanor was washing up, watching Marmalade bask in a patch of light on the rag rug. The old cat stretched, her spine arching, claws flexing, revealing the pale pink pads of her paws. Then she did something unusual. Instead of settling back down, she stood up, shook herself thoroughly, sending dust motes dancing in the sunbeam, and walked purposefully towards the back door. She stopped, looked back at Eleanor, and let out a single, clear MRP? Not a demand, but an invitation? Curious, Eleanor dried her hands and opened the door. The cold air bit sharply, carrying the clean scent of frost and dormant earth. Marmalade padded out, not with her usual cemetery-bound determination, but with a slower, almost exploratory gait. She headed not down the lane, but into the tangled wilderness that was Gran's back garden. Eleanor followed, pulling her cardigan tighter. The garden was a mess. Years of gentle neglect had allowed brambles to encroach, roses to grow leggy and wild, herb beds to be swallowed by weeds. Yet, beneath the winter bareness, Eleanor could see the bones of what it had been, Gran's pride and joy. Rows for vegetables, a patch for cutting flowers, a corner where lavender bushes had once thrived, now choked by couch grass. Marmalade picked her way through the frosted stalks and fallen leaves with surprising agility, heading towards that overgrown lavender corner. She stopped near the base of a gnarled old apple tree, its branches skeletal against the pale sky. Eleanor watched as Marmalade began to sniff intently at the base of the tree, pushing aside dead leaves with her nose. Then she started to dig. Not frantically, but with a slow, deliberate purpose, her front paws working in tandem, scraping away the cold, damp soil. It wasn't deep digging, just enough to create a small, neat hollow. Eleanor held her breath, a ridiculous thought flickering. Is she burying something? A mouse? But Marmalade paused. She looked up at Eleanor, then back at the hollow she'd made. Then, incredibly, she turned and walked back towards the cottage. Not running, but with a steady, unhurried pace. Eleanor, bewildered, followed. Marmalade went straight to the kitchen windowsill where the two river stones sat. Patience. Courage. She looked at them, then looked pointedly at Eleanor. Her tail gave a single, decisive flick. "What is it, old girl?" Eleanor murmured, kneeling beside her. Marmalade nudged the stone-marked courage with her nose. Then she looked back towards the garden door. Understanding dawned, slow and warm. You want me to bring it? To the garden?" Marmalade didn't meow. She simply sat down, wrapping her tail around her paws, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. Waiting. With a feeling of profound reverence, Eleanor picked up the smooth, gray stone. Courage. It felt cool and solid in her palm. She followed Marmalade back out into the frosty garden, to the small hollow beneath the apple tree. Marmalade watched as Eleanor knelt. She placed the stone carefully into the shallow depression. It nestled there, the single painted word gleaming faintly in the winter light. Marmalade immediately stepped forward. She didn't bury it herself. Instead, she nudged the loose soil Eleanor had dug out back over the stone with her nose and paws, covering it completely, patting it down with surprising efficiency. When it was done, she sat back on her haunches beside the freshly turned earth, looking first at the spot, then up at Eleanor. Her purr started, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the cold ground. It wasn't the purr of contentment she had for the scarf. It was a purr of completion, of a task fulfilled. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of awe. This ancient cat, guided by instincts Eleanor could only guess at, had orchestrated this. She had led Eleanor to Gran's scent-preserved scarf, a gift of tangible memory. And now, as that scent faded, she had shown Eleanor where to plant something else. Not a physical object, but a message. Courage. Buried not as an end, but as a seed. Gran's final lesson, delivered through the paws of her most faithful companion. The significance unfolded within Eleanor like a slow sunrise. Gran hadn't just collected these stones, she'd lived by them. Patience, embodied in Marmalade's unwavering vigil, in the slow unfolding of grief in the garden's cycles. Courage, the courage to face loss, to open locked drawers and locked hearts, to make choices, to stay. And now, Marmalade had buried courage in the earth, in Gran's garden. It felt like a passing of the mantle. A silent instruction, it's time to grow something new. The next morning, Eleanor didn't watch Marmalade leave for the cemetery. She pulled on Gran's old gardening gloves, stiff with disuse, and walked into the neglected garden. The air was still cold, but the weak sun held a promise. She started not with the daunting task of clearing everything, but with the lavender corner. Kneeling on the frozen earth, she began pulling away the choking weeds, her fingers numb but her heart strangely light. Marmalade returned from the cemetery earlier than usual. She didn't go straight inside. She came to the garden, settling herself on a patch of frosty grass near where Eleanor worked, watching her with those calm, clouded eyes. Her presence wasn't demanding, it was supportive. A quiet witness. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor's hands grew rough, her back ached, but the garden began to breathe again. She cleared beds, pruned the rampant roses, unearthed forgotten clumps of daffodil bulbs pushing green spears through the soil. She ordered lavender plants, the same variety Gran had loved. The act of tending the earth, of preparing it for new life, felt like tending her own spirit. The cottage wasn't just a place of memory anymore. It was becoming a place of doing, of living forward. One blustery February day, the scarf gift revealed its final layer. Eleanor decided to wash it. The lavender scent was almost gone, replaced by the comforting, musky smell of marmalade. She filled the old stone sink with lukewarm water and gentle soap, submerging the soft wool. As she carefully squeezed the water through the fibers, something hard bumped against her fingers. Startled, she felt along the seam. There, sewn into the hem with tiny, almost invisible stitches, was a small, flat object. Her heart leapt into her throat. Had she missed this? With trembling fingers, she snipped the threads. Out tumbled not a jewel, but another smooth river stone. Smaller than the others. This one bore no painted word. Instead, etched deeply into its gray surface by a careful, patient hand, was a single symbol, a heart. Simple, unadorned, undeniable. Eleanor clutched the small stone, water dripping from the scarf onto the flagstones. She looked at the symbol, then out the window to the garden where she'd buried courage, then to Marmalade, asleep in a sunbeam, her flank rising and falling peacefully. The message wasn't in words. It was in the stone itself, in the symbol, in the act of hiding it and the act of finding it. Patience. Courage. And beneath it all, the foundation, the reason, love. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. It was a quiet confirmation. The final gift wasn't the scarf, nor the stone buried in the garden, nor this newly discovered heart. The final gift was the understanding, delivered by a grieving cat and a hidden stone, that Gran's love wasn't locked away in bureaus or buried in graves. It was woven into the fabric of the scarf Marmalade cherished, sewn into the hem of their lives. It was planted in the garden Eleanor was reviving. It vibrated in the purr of an old tabby cat basking in the sun. It was the quiet courage to keep living, to keep loving, even when the scent fades. The heart stone, cool and smooth in her palm, wasn't just a symbol Gran had left. It was the steady, enduring beat of her presence, echoing in the choices Eleanor made every day to stay, to tend, to remember, and to grow. Marmalade stretched in her sleep, releasing a soft sigh. The final gift wasn't something to be found. It was the realization that it had been there all along, waiting to be recognized, nurtured, and passed on. Marmalade's days were slower, softer. Her cemetery visits remained, but they were shorter now, more like gentle conversations than desperate vigils. She'd walk there with Eleanor most mornings, a slow, meandering procession through lanes bursting with new life. At the grave, she'd circle once, sniff the earth, perhaps catching the faintest ghost of Gran beneath the scent of growing grass, then often curl up for a brief nap in the weak sunshine, her purr a soft counterpoint to the chirping of sparrows. Her devotion hadn't lessened, it had matured. It was no longer a cry against the void, but a peaceful coexistence with absence, a testament that had found its place in the living world. Eleanor watched her, the small, etched heart stone a constant, smooth weight in her pocket. She'd taken to rubbing it with her thumb when lost in thought, a grounding touchstone. The frantic need to do, to sort, to organize, to escape back to London, had dissolved. Fern Hollow wasn't just Gran's home anymore, it was becoming hers. She'd made the cottage her own, painting the kitchen a soft buttercup yellow, filling vases with garden cuttings, leaving her sketchbook open on the table. The river stones, patience, and the buried courage were no longer abstract concepts. They were the rhythm of her days, the patience required to nurture the garden, to sit quietly with Marmalade's ancient stillness, the courage it took to build a life rooted in memory, not defined by it. One soft April evening, dusk painting the sky in watercolor streaks of peach and lavender, Eleanor sat on the back step. Marmalade lay beside her, a warm, purring loaf on the sun-warmed stone. The newly planted lavender bushes were small, vulnerable spears of green, but they held the promise of scent and bees and future harvests. Eleanor watched a robin hop across the freshly turned earth near the apple tree, where courage lay buried. This, she realized, gazing at the peaceful cat, the hopeful garden, the cottage glowing softly behind them, this is the meaning. It wasn't a grand revelation shouted from rooftops. It was a quiet understanding settling into her bones, as natural as the turning of the seasons. Love wasn't a possession locked away or a ghost haunting the corners. It wasn't erased by death or diminished by time. Love was a current. It flowed. It changed form. It moved from the fierce, silent devotion of an old tabby sleeping on a grave, to the scent trapped in a scarf, to the message etched on a stone, to the hands tending new life in old soil. It flowed from Gran, through Marmalade, and now, through Eleanor herself. The story wasn't just about a cat's loyalty. It was about how love, in its purest forms, seeks connection, even across the unfathomable gulf of loss. It was about how grief, when shared, when witnessed by another beating heart, even one covered in fur, becomes bearable. Transformative. Marmalade hadn't just grieved, She had taught Eleanor how to grieve, not with words, but with her presence, her persistence, her instinctive understanding that some bonds refuse to be severed by mere physical absence. She had shown Eleanor that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about finding ways to carry the love forward, to weave it into the fabric of the life that remains. Animals don't ponder mortality or philosophy, but they feel deeply, uncomplicatedly. Marmalade's journey, from the raw agony of the graveside vigil, through the desperate scratching at a locked drawer holding her world's scent, to the peaceful acceptance of a purring nap beside Eleanor in the garden, was a masterclass in enduring love. It was a reminder that loyalty isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet scrape of claws on wood in the dead of night. Sometimes, it's a paw placed gently on an arm soaked with tears. Sometimes, it's leading someone to a stone that says courage and showing them where to plant it. Marmalade stirred beside her, stretching her stiff back legs with a soft groan. She blinked her clouded green eyes slowly at Eleanor, then nudged her hand with a cool, damp nose. Eleanor smiled, scratching the thick fur under the cat's chin, feeling the vibration of the purr resonate up her arm. "I know, old girl," she murmured. "Sun's nearly gone." She stood, offering a hand for Marmalade to lean against as the cat heaved herself up. Together, they walked back into the cottage, the warmth enveloping them. Eleanor lit a single lamp, the soft light pooling on the table where the sketchbook lay open. On a fresh page, drawn in soft charcoal, was Marmalade, not as the frail mourner, but as the serene elder she'd become, curled in a patch of spring sunlight, one paw resting lightly on a smooth river stone bearing a simple etched heart. The message wasn't shouted, it was whispered in the quiet of the cottage, in the rhythm of Marmalade's breathing, in the scent of earth drifting through the open window. It was this: love is the only thing that truly endures. It outlives bodies, outlasts scent, transcends species. It flows through us, a quiet, persistent current, seeking connection, seeking expression. And sometimes, when the world feels fractured by loss, the most profound teachers come on four paws, bearing lessons written not in words, but in purrs, in unwavering gazes, and in the quiet courage to keep loving, keep living, even when the heart feels broken. Grief isn't the end of the story. It's just the soil where new forms of love take root, if we have the patience to tend them and the courage to let them grow. Eleanor closed the sketchbook. She looked at Marmalade, who had already settled into her basket, kneading the lavender-gray scarf contentedly before curling into a perfect circle. The lamp light caught the silver in her ginger fur, making her seem like a creature spun from starlight and ancient wisdom. Outside, the first stars pricked the violet sky. The cottage was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of memory, full of peace, full of the quiet, resilient hum of a love that had weathered the deepest winter and was now gently, stubbornly blossoming. The old tabby's eyes drifted closed, her purr deepening into the soft rumble of sleep. Her work, it seemed, was done. She had guarded the grave. She had unearthed the scent. She had planted the seed of courage. She had revealed the hidden heart. She had guided a lost soul home. Now she rested. Orange Heart, if this story of loyalty, love, and an old tabby's quiet wisdom touched your heart, please like this video. It tells us these stories matter. Subscribe for more journeys into the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Comment below with globe showing Europe, Africa, where in the world you're listening from. Your connection means everything. Share this with anyone who understands the enduring power of love. And tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily tales of hope, healing, and the unexpected heroes with paws. Because sometimes, the most profound teachers walk on silent feet, and the greatest love stories are whispered in purrs. Thank you for listening.